So here we are in our covenant and series, if we can change the slides in the front and in the back. So creation and covenant series. Here we are, Unit 2, moving along into the story of one of the most important people in the Bible. Can we all stand to read the word of the Lord to begin his story today? It's 3 slides. Can you all read that? If you cannot, it's also in the back, okay? Or you can open it on your phone. Genesis 12, verse 1 to 5. We have 3 slides. We're going to read it out loud together today to declare the power of the word of the Lord among us. So ready? Begin. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and headed for the land of Canaan. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. Last slide. Ready? Begin. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abram replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son?" The Lord said to him, "No, you will have a son of your own, who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So here we are. Here's the context. Remember, what is the most important thing when you read the Bible? Context. Context is the most important thing. What was happening historically? What was happening when it was written? What is going on in this whole thing, okay? So from Adam to Abram, it's been roughly about 1,900 to 2,000 years, okay? So from Adam to Abram, we're at about almost 2,000 years have passed, okay? And it's been about 400 plus years since Noah and the flood, okay? So we had Noah and the flood. Everything was started with Noah and his family. Then we had Tower of Babel. And now here we are with this one man. Why is Abram, this one man, so important? Why is it so critical? Remember, context. You have to know the context. Otherwise, Abram is just some old dude that can't have kids. Okay, that's all he is. But the context is this. Back in Genesis 3:15, there was one very, very important promise that God made. And that promise is being fulfilled all throughout Scripture. Everything that comes after it is all tied back to this verse. And it's this here. In the garden, he's speaking to Adam and Eve and the serpent. And he's saying, "One day I will cause hostility between you, the serpent, Satan, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. One day someone will come from her that will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. One day there will be someone who will crush, literally, sin, death, everything you set into motion, serpent, in the garden. One day, out of her, out of Eve, will come someone who will crush you." Okay? This is pretty awesome. So here we are. All throughout Scripture is fulfilling this one promise. But remember, he tied this promise to a person. So from Eve, from her line, from humanity, must come somebody. That means Jesus, right, had like father, grandfather, great, like all the way back. There has to be one family through whom he must come through. Isn't it ironic that the one family that God picks is the one that can't have kids? Like God, if you're going to pick any family, pick the most fertile couple. Okay, don't pick the one that is old grandma, grandpa, and they're dying and they literally cannot have kids. But that's who he picks. He picks Abram. Why Abram? We don't know. There's nothing special about him that we know about him before. The only thing we know before Genesis 12 is Genesis 11, right? That makes sense, right? Okay, so the previous few verses before Abram's story, we see that his father, Terah, for whatever reason, took his family from the land of Ur, which is in like southeast Iraq nowadays, okay? And he traveled on his way to Canaan, where Abram was supposed to go, but they stopped in Haran. And that's where they stopped. That's all we know. There was nothing particularly special about Abram. We do know that Abram probably, he was from a pagan family. So like they lived in a very, very strong ancient Babylonian culture, worshiped gods. They were idol worshipers. So Abram and his family were idol worshipers. They were not anything special apart from like God calling him. So they probably worshiped idols. They're probably pagan. They probably were actually pretty wealthy, because Abram could make this journey. In Genesis 12, the next passage, we see that he took literally his wife, his nephew, and it's not in here, but he took all of his servants, all of his flock, and they left. So he was a man of substantial fortune. He was not a poor guy, okay? So here he is, nothing special but those things about him. Out of nowhere, literally out of the blue. This man has not been worshiping God, but out of the blue, the Lord said. When the Lord speaks, your life can literally turn upside down. When the Lord speaks into your life, your whole life can turn upside down. And that's what happened to Abram. The Lord spoke. We have no idea how he spoke. In this particular system, we have no idea. We see that he spoke to God in a vision and dreams, but in this particular moment, we have no idea how God spoke. But somehow, God spoke in a way that to Abram, he fully understood. Can you imagine? You're living a great life. Okay, in this culture, in this time, you don't just leave your family. Your family is your safety. Your last name, like the family you come from either makes you powerful in that area or weak. Abraham's family, he's a fairly powerful family, fairly wealthy, okay, good, like they were cushy, okay, they lived a very comfortable, good life there. You don't want to leave that when you live in these kind of times. But here he is, God spoke to him out of nowhere, and he said this, leave your country, leave your relatives, which was like, that's asking for death, okay? Leave your father's family and go. Go where? Just go to the land that I will show you. There is no end destination quite yet that he knows of. He just tells him to go. But here's the promise that God makes. I will give you many descendants. I will give you land, and you will bless the whole world. Is that enough to make you give up everything? Whatever the call was, however Abram heard it, it was enough that prompted him to then obey. That prompted him to obey. He said, I have never heard this God until this moment. But when I heard God's voice, it's like a light turned on. It's like I was living in darkness and a light turned on, and I realized what I had to do next. What's really astounding about this is that as group as Christians, we know the story so well that we're just like, oh yeah, Abraham, yeah, he was good. Okay, this man did not know God before this. Did not know God until this moment. And that voice of God alone was enough to compel Abram to obedience. So faith is not something that, I've been in church for like the last 15 years, my faith is strong. That's not how it works. You could be in the church for 1,000,000 years. Well, you won't, but many, many years, and you still might have the faith of a very small baby. Here we have Abram making this huge radical move because he heard the voice of God. When you and I are touched by God, when God speaks to us in a way that we cannot deny it is God, we are compelled to move. We are compelled to do. We are compelled to follow that voice because we know it is true. What I love about this passage is that, first of all, God called Abraham. Why? We don't know. He was not special. He did not earn it. Number 2, Abram actually heard God's call. I don't know how he did that, but he heard it. And number 3, it was so clear, so life-altering, so real that Abram responded with immediate obedience. There is no formula here. God spoke. He moved. That's it. So the question is not, oh, do I believe? No, it's like if you hear the voice of God, it will compel you to move. And that's how faith begins. Now, his faith was not perfect because God told him. So in one way, he did. He left. He moved, which was great. But he moved with who? His nephew, Lot. Now, his nephew, Lot, his dad had died. So Abram's brother had died. And he had no children. So he probably took Lot on as like his own son. Does that make sense? And so he took him with him. But God had told him, leave everyone but your wife. Leave everyone. You go out. And so, yes, Abram immediately obeyed, which was good. And we also see that he was still in partial obedience because when he took Lot with him, we see that Lot causes a lot of trouble for Abram down the road, okay, multiple times. But the point being, even in Abram's partial obedience, even in that, yet he still moved. He was still compelled to move. Verse 4. So he departed. He just went. This is not like you book a ticket and you just go. This is you gather the entire flock, you gather all the servants, you like pack your tent and you walk for hundreds of miles over like probably about 50 days is what happened. This is not an easy task, and yet he does it. He does it. What I want you to see is not about Abram himself, because Abram himself, I'm telling you, he's not actually that special, right? He was like just the average guy who couldn't have kids. That was his scenario, and yet God chose him. But because God chose him, God spoke so clearly, so distinctly that Abram could not deny the call. When God calls you in your life, whether it's the call to salvation, that he's calling everybody with that call, right? The call to say yes to him, or whether it's a calling in the way that you are called to live your life, to give your life's purpose, whatever the call is on your life, when God calls you, you cannot deny it. You can try, but it won't work very well. Because the voice of God, when it rings in your ears, in your heart, in your mind, it will ring forever and ever until you cannot deny it. This is God moving. This is not just Abraham because he's special. This is God moving in a way that then compelled Abram to respond in faith. When God called Abram to leave, it was not just an address change, okay? When God called Abram to leave, the hardest part was that was hard too, but that wasn't the hardest part, was changing your house, changing your city. That's not the hardest part. The hardest part of God's call on Abram was this. Are you listening? This is the most important part, because this is probably the hardest thing for you too. When God called Abram, the hardest thing was for Abram to relinquish control. To walk out in total faith that wherever God tells me to go, I'm going to go. And that's the right place to be. Abram had to relinquish fear of the unknown, fear of leaving his family, fear of how am I going to protect my family when I'm walking through this land that I'm a foreigner and a stranger and they could just all jump me, but like I have to protect my family. He had to relinquish every one of those things. Those are hard things for us to let go. Fear of the unknown, fear of control, fear of safety and security and provision and protection. Those are all basic things that are very hard for each and every one of us. And yet, that was the harder thing that Abram had to learn how to do. That when God called him, that was the cost. To follow was to let go of all of those things. That is why Abram is known as a father of faith. And that's why when we respond to God in faith, we are like Abraham in our response to faith. When God calls you, you will come very close face to face with the reality of fear of your unknown, your future, fear of all the things that you want control over. That is where faith comes in. Faith is saying, wait, more than those fears, more than those anxieties, this response, this God is greater than anything else I could ever fear. It's a cost-benefit analysis, and it turns out the cost to follow is heavy, but following him is worth it. That's what it ends up being for us. Hebrews 11, verse 8. We see this. Later in the New Testament, it often talks about Abraham being the father of faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he had to live there by faith because he was a foreigner, he was a stranger. Faith is the confidence in what we hope for, the assurance of things we do not see. Hebrews 11:1, faith. Faith is confidence in what you hope for and the assurance of what you do not see. So here's the most important thing. When we really, truly, truly, truly have faith, because faith has to overcome what you want to see. Faith has to overcome the assurance you find in everything else. Because in our world, we find assurance in so many other things. Our money, our security, our families, our 401ks. Start doing those because you guys are young. You have time on your side. Okay, but the point being, faith overcomes all of those things to say that this God and what he says, that is what I will follow. Faith leads to obedience. That's one of our main points. Faith leads to obedience. If we truly have faith, we will follow the God who calls us to follow him. How will you know your faith is true? When you go to a tree, how do you know it's an apple tree or an orange tree? We don't have oranges here, do we? We don't, okay. How do you know it's an apple tree? Why? How do you know? Because the fruit. An apple will come from it, right? In the same way, all of us, if our faith is true and genuine, I don't mean our faith is perfect. That's not what I'm saying. Because Abraham's faith was not perfect. Actually, in fact, many times throughout Scripture, we find Abraham making huge mistakes, some big, big mistakes that have big, big consequences. But your faith's not perfect, but your faith is true, and it's authentic, and it's genuine, and it's real. And when that faith is there, we see the fruit of it in obedience, in following him, and trusting him. Even in Abraham's weak and radical faith, we see God speaking to him. Because remember, he left, but he didn't totally do what God said. He took Lot with him. And so we have in verse 7, still God speaks to him. Then the Lord appeared to Abram when he got to Canaan. I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. Again he traveled, and there he built another altar and dedicated to the Lord and worshipped him. Every single time we see a pattern. This man with great wealth lives in a tent, nomadic, temporary shelter, all the rest of his days. And yet everywhere he goes, he builds an altar. This is not like you got like a construction vehicle with you. Like this is by hand, him building an altar out of stone. Every single place he went, though, it was that critical that he built an altar to worship God there. So we see evidence of his faith through his worship. That the man who once worshiped idols is now worshiping God and saying, this is the one I choose to follow. This is the one I choose to follow all the rest of my days. And everywhere I go, though I have no permanent place to rest my head, I will build an altar everywhere I go to worship God everywhere I go. The same radical call that was upon Abram's life is upon each of you today. Now, we are not the same as Abram. We are not going to give birth to the Messiah. That's not the point. But the point being, when God calls you into his family, when God says, my child, leave everything you know, Leave everything that's familiar and comfortable. Leave all your idols behind. The idols of security, the idols of family, whatever that is. Will you go against the culture of your time? Will you trust that I will lead you to a greater promise? Will you believe that my calling for you is greater than anything on this world? Will you believe? Will you go? Will you worship everywhere you go? That call, that exact one, is on each of us every single day. Will you have faith? Will you go? Will you be the light and salt everywhere you go? That is radically countercultural, but will you go? Will you trust in me? At some point in your life, you will hear that voice and you will face a choice, every one of us. And so what will you decide? I wonder, we have no idea biblically. The only person we have a clue is his father, Terah. I wonder if God called anybody else, but they could not obey. The only sign we have of that is Abram's dad. Because Abraham's dad started, but did not finish what Abram then finished. So we can actually assume that God potentially called Terah, Abram's dad, but he could not finish it. He could not obey to the very end. But Abram did. So just as many as God calls, there are probably many more that God called but did not respond. And so the choice is ours. Will we be ones that respond to him in faith? Respond to him in obedience? How will we decide? Now here's the thing, okay? If God calls you and he's like, I'm going to give you this whole land and all these descendants and all this blessing, and you're like, let's do it. Let's go. He goes. He makes this huge sacrifice. He's excited. He builds all these altars. He's ready to worship. He's like, okay, God, baby time. Come on. Let's make a kid. Let's make blessing. Let's do all these things. Give me the land. Give me all the things. That's probably what you would think and what Abraham thought. Okay? Like, I'm here. I followed. Where is the money? Show me your promise, right? Here we go. Genesis 15, verse 1. Do you guys know how many years have passed between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15? Genesis 12, when he was first called. 10 years have passed. Old man is now 85 years old, okay? Even older. The odds of having a child are even more slim. 85 years old. 10 years later, this is after a big squabble with Lot got kidnapped by the princes of the area. And so Abraham had to go rescue him. And now Abraham's kind of scared that they'll retaliate and counterattack, okay? So here he is, scared out of his wits. The Lord speaks to Abram in a vision this time. Said to him, do not be afraid, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. I love Abram's response here. He's like, yo, God, thank you. But here's the thing. You didn't give me a son. You didn't do what you would say. This is the only thing I care about. And you did not give this to me like you promised. Abram is so honest, but so like respectful, right? But so honest with God of like, God, like, I'm glad you're going to protect me, but you did not do the promise. You did not do what you said you would do. And then Lord said, he took him out. Good old teacher, God is like, let me give you an object lesson, okay? If you cannot understand what I'm going to say, I'm going to show it to you. Go out. Can you imagine the stars at that time? There was no like electricity. It's like no lights, right? Like only fires in that time. So like think about how bright the stars were at that time. Okay? Here he goes. He says, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. You will have that many. If you were Abram, what would you do? Would you start counting? Would you be like, that's too many, God. I don't want that many. Or what would you say? Like, what would your response be? But Abraham looked and he believed God. Though he had no child, though it's been 10 years of nothing happening, though he is old And in his body, he's probably like, this might not work. Abram believed, and the Lord counted it as righteousness. How many of you, when God speaks to you and you're like super gung-ho, and then nothing happens and you have to wait for God's promise, how many of you get discouraged and you doubt God and you start to wonder, did I hear God's voice correctly? Did I make that up? Like, that's what most of our response would be. But here's Abram. In his doubt, in his questions, God comes and meets with him again. And God reminds him again. And in that moment, Abram believed again. Because Abram believed God, God counted that as righteous. Remember, Abram's before Jesus, so there's no Jesus to die on the cross for him, right? At that moment, in that time. But in that moment, Abram believed. And simply because he believed, God said, this one is righteous. This one is righteous. That is the first picture we see of salvation. That it is not by what you do, but it is by your faith. By believing we are made righteous. Abram is the first foreshadowing of that we can see plainly in a man. That when you choose to believe, you are counted as righteous. And then how you live follows because of what you believe. So let me ask you, what about you? At some point in your spiritual journey, if you have not reached it yet, you will reach it at some point. And it will keep on happening, okay? At some point in your life, you will grow discouraged, and your faith will be shaken. It will happen, 100%, if it hasn't already. Abram had no idea at that moment. He was 10 years out, right? He had no idea that after this see the stars, wow, moment, 15 more years would pass. He has no idea 15 more years will pass before God's promise will come to pass. He has no idea. Can you imagine? No idea. 25 years, 100 years old when he sees Isaac, his son, born. When your faith is shaken, it is very tempting to doubt everything you heard from God. But in that moment, I encourage you to be like Abram. Come to him with honesty and be like, God, I know you're God, but I don't get it. Why? Why is this happening? But I will come to you and I'll wrestle with it because I know that you will meet me in my doubting. I know that you will come and speak to me. And when you speak, Lord, I will listen and I will obey. True faith leads us to obey, and it results in blessing. So, can I have the praise to come up? Faith is something that all throughout your life, he'll be shaping you all throughout your life. Why do you think it took 25 years for Abram to see the promise? God could have done it in a second. Often God has us wait because he wants us to be fully in a place where we can trust, fully in a place where we can listen, fully in a place where we can know and believe and trust. So maybe you are in a season of waiting right now. Maybe you're suddenly reminded of the times that God spoke to you many years ago. At that one place, through that one person, through that one scripture. Maybe you're reminded of that right now. And you've forgotten, to be honest. And you're like, wow, that was a long time ago. I am not anywhere near where I thought I'd be at that time. But God is saying, hey, I have not forgotten. I have not forgotten. And so I am calling you, each and every one of you, to know me again, to trust me again, to listen and obey again. Can we all stand? Today we're going to sing the song Oceans, because faith is like stepping into an ocean. You know, in the ocean, okay, it's really fun, it's really pretty. And the first, waist high is okay, right? Waist high I can do. But then you know that moment in the ocean when you go further and there's this sudden like you can't feel the sand under your feet anymore. That moment, then you're like, sharks. Or like, what, jelly? I don't know. Someone's gonna eat me, okay? Or I'm gonna get carried off to die in the ocean, you know? It's so scary. That moment, like, loving Jesus is really fun when you're like waist high. But God's like, hey, I want you to come all the way in. And then you're like, oh, I don't know about that. That looks scary. But the only way to know him deeply is to surrender fully. The only way to live a life of full faith is to say yes to him truly again and again, in the doubt and the worry and the fear. The only way to know him fully is to surrender fully. And so, can we sing this song together? And may this be our prayer once again, to rededicate to him our faith and our hearts.